Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode. Today I'm going to talk to you about a macro lens that is also a street lens. It's the 40mm TT Artisans f2.8 macro. It's another affordable macro from the Chinese manufacturers. Here it is on the Fuji X-T2. And this lens is going to sell for around about £150, so it really is an affordable macro alternative. It's an APS-C lens. I've been shooting it on a Fuji camera, which of course have APS-C sensors, but they're also available in Sony E-mount, in Canon mounts, and in all the other mounts for APS-C cameras. I didn't buy this lens. The people at TT Artisans were kind enough to send it to me, but of course I'm going to give you an honest and thorough appraisal of what I like about it and what I don't like about it. So let's just have a closer look. It's a very nicely made lens. It's all metal. I think it's made of anodized aluminium because it's fairly light. It's not a heavy lens. If I compare it to another lens that I've got here, this is an Olympus macro lens and it's quite a bit heavier. This is a 1:2 macro lens, so it doesn't quite have the magnification, but it's quite a bit heavier than that lens. So I think this lens must be made of anodized aluminium of some kind. It's very strong, it's very tough, and it all feels very nice. It's all finished very nicely in this nice smooth finish. The focus ring turns very nicely and sweetly. There's no play or slop or roughness in that mechanism at all. The 7 Artisans 60mm macro that I tested did have a little play in the focus ring, but in this one there's nothing. It's absolutely tight. And similarly for the aperture ring, which is at the back of the lens here, that turns in half stops. It's a clicky aperture, and again it turns very nicely, very smoothly, and everything is made very nicely. Now there's not a great deal of, or rather there is a great deal of movement on the lens ring from the minimum focus distance of 0.17 meters all the way around to 1 meter. So if I turn it from that distance to 1 meter, we'll find that, let's have some focus please, thank you very much, we'll find that there's actually a fair old bit of turn between those 2 points, and that's around about 360 degrees, or maybe even a little more of turn. So there's a lot of opportunity for fine-tuning macro subjects, which is exactly what you need. However, from 1 meter, which is, where is 1 meter? Oh my goodness. Okay, so from 1 meter, which is here, we can see that there really isn't a great deal of movement. Are we focused? Yes, we are. There really isn't a great deal of movement from 1 meter to infinity. That was a bit of a problem on the 7 Artisans 60mm macro I tested recently, but it's much less of a problem on this lens because it has that 40mm field of view. This is a 40mm lens, so for every degree of turn you make on there, the adjustment of the focus is different, and of course it doesn't take as much focusing adjustment on a 40mm lens at longer distances. So that's why this lens is good for everyday photography, and in particular I think for street photography. Now there is one thing I have to say, and that is to do with engravings. We've still got, as in all the Chinese lenses that I've tested recently, we've got printed markings on the barrel. Now that's fine, they're very clear, and there's no problem with them, but really this is such a nice quality feeling lens that I do think Engravings would be better there. So DJ Optical Works, if you can manage to make those engraved, I don't know, but I don't imagine it would increase production costs too much, then you would have a better lens and a better quality lens also. It would just put the finishing touch to the quality feeling of the lens. So, as I've said, this is a macro lens that can also be used as a street lens. It takes great pictures of small things. It works really, really well as a macro lens, and it does everything you'd expect it to do as a macro lens. I had hours of fun using it. The usual rules with macro photography apply. That is, you don't have too much depth of field. Depth of field is very, very shallow unless you stop down a lot. It's generally a little difficult to focus, especially if you're focusing a moving object or an object that's outside moving in the breeze, and so use a tripod if you can. All those usual rules apply, but it's a great lens for photographing small things. It's a very, very competent macro lens. I've no complaints at all about it in that regard. It's very sharp when it's wide open, but of course when it's wide open you get tiny depth of field, so you do have to stop down really, unless you're shooting for a particular aesthetic effect. So it's sharp at those very short distances, but a little better if stopped down. Now, I do love shooting macro photography, and this one's great for looking at really tiny things, and it's one of the cheapest one-to-one macros there is. One-to-one macros are usually much more expensive than this. You can pay 10 times the price for a macro lens that probably won't do a great deal more than this one. It may be a little technically better, but for the casual user, for the everyday user, even for the serious user, this is a very good, technically very competent macro lens. If you want a great macro lens, you could do a great deal worse than one of these. So let's talk about this use then as a general photography street lens. It's a great macro lens, it's very competent for that, but it does have this dual nature. It's a 40mm lens, don't forget. It behaves as a 60mm on an APS-C sensor because of the field of view that that sensor gives, but it's still a 40mm lens, and as such, at longer distances, it has a deeper depth of field. It has less natural shallow depth of field, less blur than say the 7/8 60mm. So that's why it's also a great street lens. Wide open, it's easy to focus and still maintain some separation if you want to, though you do have to work a little at that. Or you can set it to f8 and be there. In other words, if you set this lens to f8, as I did yesterday while I was out shooting, just to see what it would do, and then set the focus scale to, let's say, just over a meter, let's say 2 meters or thereabouts, most of the visual field from about 1 meter to possibly just shy of infinity is going to be in focus. So you can use this lens as a point and shoot, and I did have a little practice of that yesterday, and I got some fairly reasonable results for it from it. So you can use it that way, and I was quite surprised. Some of my shots were a little blurred. I was just having an initial go at it just to see what it could do, but with practice this could be a very, very competent street walkabout lens that you can use like a point and shoot. Whack up the ISO so you've got good exposure, set it to f8 and to about 2 meters, and you get a really deep focus within that visual field. And with a bit of practice, as I say, that's going to become second nature, and you're going to become really good at that. And that's a really good string to this lens's bow. There aren't too many macro lenses I know of that can be used of in that way. It's a real bonus to this lens, and it really gives it a dual character. Okay, let's talk about background blur. I'll just pop it back on the camera first so that I don't get any dust on this lovely X-T2 sensor. Well, background blur at short distances, at macro distances, of course, is practically infinite. It fills the frame apart from the thing that you're focused on, so you've got very, very tiny depth of field at macro distances, and the blur is enormous, so of course you're going to have to stop down at those distances if you want to get anything more than a tiny, perhaps maybe a millimeter or so of your subject in focus. However, because this is a 40mm lens, at longer distances there isn't a great deal of background blur. It's actually fairly minimal, and what there is it's relatively bland as well. This is not particularly exciting blur. It doesn't swirl, for example, in the manner of a Helios or a Biotar or even some of the newer lenses. So it's not got a particularly great deal of character. That changes with distance, of course, but I found that much of the time the blur was relatively bland. So this is not a blur monster when used at everyday photography lengths. It is, of course, at the macro distances, but that's a different thing. At everyday photography lengths, general photography lengths, then this is not a blur monster. It's certainly pleasant enough though, and it's always smooth blur, and it's never rough. It's not harsh or unpleasant blur in the way that some of the vintage lenses could make. Right throughout the range, and also at different distances between camera, subject and background, the blur remains well behaved. It never becomes unpleasant or harsh. Colours, I'm just looking at a couple of the shots that I've made with it. Colours are really quite strong and resonant with this lens. They seem to have a similar character to many of the other Chinese lenses I've tested, in that they are fairly saturated, but they're not oversaturated. They're sort of somewhere in the middle. They certainly won't overwhelm you, but they won't underwhelm you either. It gave very good colour performance on this Fuji camera, and I think the best colour setting that I set it to for general purpose was Pergear. Going in a little, doing the macro shots, I found I needed Velvia, which is the vivid setting on these Fuji cameras, because I don't know, perhaps it's something to do with the light that you lose at those very close distances. So colour, very nice actually, a very nice, pleasant, refreshing colour balance, plenty of body, plenty of depth, plenty of strength, but not too overwhelming and not too underwhelming either. I was entirely happy with the colour representation from this lens. Contrast is pretty strong on this lens. It's very resistant to flare also, and I'll show you why. It's got a very, very deep well. The front element is buried, what, gosh, that far? An inch and a half, a couple of inches right down the barrel. So we'll just have a quick look at that. So I'm not sure if you can see that, but that front element is way, way down at the bottom of the barrel. I think you can just see it there. So that is a reason why this lens is very resistant to flaring. I didn't manage to catch it out while I was using it. That's how resistant to flaring it is. You could always use a hood on it if you're using it in extremely bright conditions with a very, very bright sun. I must admit I didn't have any direct sunlight yesterday when I went out to use it, but all the same it was very resistant to contrast dropping, so that's excellent performance, and I don't have any complaints on that front at all. Sharpness, well, macro lenses are generally inherently very sharp. This one's no exception. It's got very good sharpness, even wide open. It sharpens up a bit, stop down, but not by very much actually, and it really isn't that noticeable. You have to look really, really closely to see it, and I reckon around about f4 actually is this lens's maximum sharpness. You don't really need to go much further than that to get the full sharpness out of this lens. Stopping right down to f16 or so, well, sometimes you can get a little bit of diffraction softening, but this lens is very good in that regard, and I didn't see that happen at all, in fact. So sharpness is generally pretty excellent with this lens. As far as purple fringing goes, well, there is a tiny bit sometimes visible. It doesn't show itself that much, and I only noticed one example where it became evident, and even then I had to look for it. So you're not going to see a great deal of purple fringing with this lens. Even the best lenses have one or two tiny little faults in their composition and design, and even they will show a tiny bit of purple fringing at one point or another, but certainly no complaints about this one on that particular matter. So, all things considered, this is a really nice little lens, and at around £150 it's a very, very cheap way into one-to-one macro. I like it better than the 7 Artisans 60mm f2.8 macro, because that shorter focal length of 40mm makes it a better street lens and makes it more usable as an everyday photography lens. So it's not quite so much a specialized macro lens, although it does the specialized macro stuff excellently. If you want to dip a toe into the waters of macro photography, you really couldn't do it with a better one than this. A very, very nice little lens indeed, and very affordable too. So that is it from me for today. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the old bell thing before you go. And if you'd like to help this channel grow and develop, if you'd like to support it, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you soon for some more Zenography.